Well, welcome everyone to the fourth session of the CARPHA CariPHLN Biosafety and Biosecurity webinar series that we're hosting in collaboration with the CDC's Caribbean Regional Office and our colleagues at the US CDC's WHO Collaborating Center on Biosafety and Biosecurity. And this is the penultimate session in the series, but one of the most important sessions because we're focusing on, and I'm seeing the incorrect information here, so just allow me to go back here again. Pause the share. On the topics that have been coming up time and time again about the two hot topics on PPE and decontamination and waste management. So, as you know, our objective has always been to ensure that we are providing information to you. And let me just come back here. Here we go. To provide the guidance for use of the WHO LBM-4 and their specific monologues. And so today we'll be looking at PPE and decontamination and waste management. And as always, we've tried to have the experts deliver these presentations and discussions. So you have the experts here, persons who've actually helped to write the monographs, to be able to ask them the pertinent questions as well and to get their feedback and advice during these sessions. So without further ado, we'll go straight into our first presentation, and that will be on personal protective equipment. It's really my honor to introduce Dr. Catherine Mackison-Booth, who has been very instrumental in the writing and editing of the WHO LBM-4 in totality, but specifically Catherine's passion has been in working with PPE. So we may have to ask Catherine to come back again if she can't cover all the things that she would like to today. And so as part of Catherine's bio, she has a degree in microbial sciences, and for the past 17 years, she has worked as a scientist for the Health and Safety Executive in the United Kingdom. And as you can imagine, she's been involved in many projects, ranging from testing the effectiveness of decontamination systems to measuring the levels of hydrogen sulfide and methane from slurry pits, and of course, a lot of training of individuals in biosafety. And we will place in the chat during Catherine's presentation a video about a system that she actually invented known as Vomiting Larry. Interesting, Catherine. I'm sure you'll tell us a little bit more about what Vomiting Larry can do. But now, in addition to having worked with Dr. Kaz Kojima and his team on the WHO LBM-4, congratulations, Kat. Since June 2021, you've been working with the WHO team full-time. And outside of work, she still finds time to garden, walk, and I found this most interesting, learning about car mechanics and racing. So thanks for being with us, Kat. We're really privileged to have you on board. And let me also mention that none of this would have been possible without our colleague Chris Shield, who has been instrumental in really creating the links for us. So thanks so much, and over to you. Welcome everyone again. For those who've joined us since I started, please place your name and your affiliation country in the chat. And great to see colleagues from all over the globe join us today. Kat, over to you.
Hello, thank you, Sasha.
Hi, sorry,
everyone.
just now, before you start, I see a hand up. I'm not sure why. Is it that someone is not hearing? Okay, I'm seeing hands up. I'm not sure. If you have a question, please place it in the chat. Sorry, go ahead, Kat.
That's okay.
The chat or the
Don't
Q&A
worry,
box?
don't worry.
Thank you. There you go.
Thanks, everyone. I'll try and share my screen for you. Bear with. Okay, can you see that on your screens?
We can.
Yes, we can. You just have to put it into full screen. Right, so it's in full screen and it's on the first slide.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you very much for that great introduction. I'm going to stop my video just so that I don't see myself while I'm talking, because it's a bit off-putting. So welcome, everybody. I appreciate PPE or personal protective equipment is a bit of a challenging topic to cover in 30 minutes or so. So I'll do my best. I might skip through a few slides, and Sasha, if I'm running past time, please do just shout. So I'm going to cover a little bit about the brief overview of the PPE monograph that's related to the 4th edition of the Lab Biosafety Manual, cover a little bit on the risk assessment process for selecting personal protective equipment, types of PPE, and what I think might be really useful for everybody, particularly for training colleagues and new starters. And then just to wrap up, we'll have some key principles. There we go. So first question, what is PPE? So PPE is any equipment, clothing that's worn or held by people to protect them from exposure to, in the biosafety sense, biological agents, but it could be things like chemicals as well, or radiological items. So we've got the common gloves, lab coats, etc. But we might also have badges for protecting us against radiation, like the middle picture shows, or handheld monitors, like the last picture shows, for checking whether an environment is safe to walk into. So for example, after fumigation. Hazards. So the PPE is there to protect us primarily against biological agents. As you can see here, I love these cuddly giant microbes. They're really good for training, particularly children. But that's the key protection that we're wanting to confer from the PPE that we're wearing, but it's not the only protection that we might need. So we might need protection from, for example, chemicals, thermal protection, be that cold for cryogenics, or heat if we're using Bunsen burners. We might have slippery surfaces, items that we can trip over, sharps. We might be working with animals or insects, and obviously electricity as well. So the LBM4 has moved away from a prescriptive approach to biosafety and has moved towards a risk and evidence-based approach. And that includes looking at the selection of PPE based on a thorough assessment of the risks. And there are lots of options, as we know, in some cases, perhaps too many options. So in the LBM4, there are a number of core requirements, and that sets out, as we'll see, a range of possible protective equipments to wear. There are then heightened control measures and maximum containment measures. And again, the LBM4 lists lots of options for that. It highlights training and competence importance. That's particularly important for looking at the different types of PPE, the storage of it, maintenance, putting it on, using it, taking it off, decontaminating it and disposing of it appropriately. The importance of hand hygiene thereafter is also covered in the monograph, and it also covers standards and regulations that are relevant to the local context. So the need for PPE is determined, as we mentioned, through thorough assessment of the risks based upon the types of biological agents being handled and the procedures and activities being carried out. So based on that risk assessment, there are a number of questions that we need to address, and these are selection criteria. So who could be exposed? Is it just us, or is it our colleagues? And to what? Is it just biological agents? Is it chemicals, thermals, etc.? How long will the PPE be worn? Because that adds a comfort factor and a reliability factor. Are there any standards and/or local regulations that we need to adhere to? Any contradictions for use, so maybe there's a medical reason that we can't use a particular type of PPE, or allergies, for example. Size and shape requirements. So one size of PPE doesn't fit all, as I think we're probably all very well aware. And fit and comfort and mobility requirements, particularly for extended use. Effects on dexterity, which we'll come on to particularly when we're looking at gloves, is really important in terms of balancing protection and the likelihood of increasing the likelihood of an accident. Requirements for cleaning, disinfection, maintenance and storage, etc. Compatibility with other PPE, and here in particular we're talking about things like glasses or safety eye protection with respiratory protective equipment, for example. Training requirements, because we all need to know how to use the PPE that we want to use. Other control measures that might be in place. So do we need to use RPE, or can we work in a biological safety cabinet, for example? How availability is the stock? And I think we've all had issues with that over the last year and a half. Are there any lead times? Do we have enough storage space in our laboratories? Reliability over time and shelf life is also important. User feedback if the PPE has been used before. And of course, the price is obviously important as well, particularly if there's a cheaper alternative, it needs to be the same effectiveness. Okay, so this is a table taken from the Lab Biosafety Manual, 4th edition. It looks at core requirements, heightened control measures and maximum containment measures, and offers examples of PPE for each of those. In terms of core requirements, there isn't a requirement for respiratory protection in core requirements because it's thought that it shouldn't need to be used, although we might want to use some sort of RPE for things like agar preparation, where you use it if you're making up a lot of agar. It's obviously quite a dusty atmosphere, so if you've not got a controlled environment for that, then respiratory protection might be required there, but that would come under a heightened control measure. So I just wanted to raise this risk assessment monograph. So this is taken from the risk assessment monograph, and it gives example scenarios for the application of the key stages of a risk assessment cycle to enable risk reduction to that acceptable or risk tolerance level. And there's just a couple of examples here with the same sort of biological agent, but with different activities, and that they might require different control measures, and it includes options for personal protective equipment in those. So it might be worth having a look in the risk assessment monograph, as well as the PPE one, for looking at ideas for what you want to use for your PPE. So types of PPE then, we've got footwear, clothing, face and eye protection, respiratory protection, and gloves, and we're going to cover all those in greater or lesser detail depending on time constraints. So footwear. Footwear needs to be well-fitting and comfortable, particularly if we have long days in the lab. I think we've all been there. Needs to be sensible to prevent slips and trips, and also closed toe to prevent stubbing of toes, which is the key consideration for that. There is an element that people talk about in terms of infection prevention for closed toes, but I'm not sure how well founded that is, given we can have, like pump type closed toe shoes, but that wouldn't really protect us against infection. So there's a bit of a debate about that. It may reduce injury from falling objects, so if we drop a flask of something or tubes, etc. But again, it's usually our own footwear that we wear in terms of core requirements, and that's not personal protective equipment per se. If we needed something to protect us against falling objects specifically, then we'd obviously need some specific PPE, steel toe cap boots, for example, to minimise that type of injury. They may reduce contamination in case of a spill, but if a spill happens, we're going to be taking that footwear off, decontaminating, etc. So unless there is an absolute need for dedicated splash resistant footwear and leg protection, which would be a heightened control measure, then we wouldn't normally have that in our day-to-day routine lab working. And again, dedicated footwear or shoe covers might be required as a heightened control measure. Shoe covers in particular, so if you've had a spill, say in a containment laboratory, you've come out of that laboratory but you need to go back in to clean up, then shoe covers would be a really good option for that. I was asked to talk a little bit about slingback Crocs, which I think are very comfortable. I think I personally think they're a good idea for wearing in the laboratory. There is issues with kind of they often have a lot of holes, which is great for breathability, but in case of splash, if you do have kind of athlete's foot or whatever, then that can be an issue. And in terms of heels, I suppose it depends how stable you are on your on your legs if you want to wear heels. But if you're perfectly stable and there's no real reason why you can't wear heels, I wouldn't recommend wearing stilettos. But you know, if it's a short heel, I don't see why not, so long as you know you're not increasing your likelihood of tripping. So that's footwear. Clothing, including laboratory coats, gowns, coveralls or suits, whichever terminology you prefer, and you may want to wear aprons and sleeves for added splash protection. With all of those things, they need to be comfortable, worn correctly, the right size, splash resistant ideally, disposable or reusable is fine, and decontaminated and discarded appropriately. So the laboratory coats and gowns need to cover the knees but not trail on the floor. If you're short like me, that could be an issue. Full length sleeves, preferably fitted cuffs, because that makes the gloves easier to wear and put over the top of the cuff of the lab coat. And sleeves shouldn't be rolled up because you're exposing your arms. Excuse me. They need to be high necked, preferably side fastening with an overlap at the front, which adds extra splash protection. They need to be fully fastened when they're being worn in the laboratory and only worn in designated areas, not in the office, as my colleague, or ex-colleague rather, Brian, in the picture is wearing. They need to be removed and decontaminated when known to be contaminated, and laundered regularly if they're reusable, but not laundered at home. And I know there's potentially some discussion about that, possibly at the end of the presentation. I made a splash resistant material. So Brian, my ex-colleague here, is wearing his training lab coat that was drawn on by his daughter to show school children what different microorganisms look like, and she didn't leave the front isolator. She also did the back as well, so it's got a good spar head on the back there. So I think it's a great lab coat. So coveralls and suits. There are many different types of coveralls and suits, ranging from type 1 to type 6. What do they all mean? Well, we have indicators here. So type 1 are kind of the gas type protective suits, the CBRN type suits, up to type 3, which are the ones that we generally wore during the Ebola outbreak. They're protective against a pressurized jet of liquid. And then we have type 4 against a good splash of liquid, and then the type 5 and type 6, which would be fine for working with in a laboratory should you need extra protection above and beyond a laboratory coat. And those are represented by different symbols in the shields representing the protective factor. It can be difficult to know which suit type you have. So that it's good to check the labels and the associated information. So here we have a label, and sometimes you see the type 4B, type 5B. What does that mean? It means that it's also been tested against a biological challenge. So it's important to just double check what it is that you're wearing if you need to wear a coverall or suit. So eye protection and face protection. There are 3 different kinds, which I think we're probably all familiar with: goggles, safety glasses or safety spectacles, and face shields or visor, the latter of which protects both the face and the eyes not just because it covers the face and the eyes, but also because it prevents us from touching. They're a good option because they can be worn by everybody because they're adjustable. They're quite easy to decontaminate. Whereas goggles and glasses can be adjusted while we're in the lab. I don't know if you're like me, but I end up pushing them up my face if they're sliding down my face and not fitting correctly. If you have contaminated hands, like in this picture, and you're touching your face or moving your hair, then you have an increased likelihood of exposure. So respiratory protection, which again, I think we've all picked up a lot of over the last year and a half. There are two broad types of respiratory protective devices, and they are respirators, which are non-powered, and powered hoods or air purifying respirators, PAPRs. So respirators can be disposable, like figure 1. This is often referred to as a filtering face piece, or FFP, you'll have heard it known, or an N if you're in an American mask. And that just means that the whole material that composes the mask is the filter material. Whereas you can have reusable, what are called half masks. So they cover half of your face, essentially your nose, and your mouth. Reusable half masks are reusable except for the filters. So the filters on the sides of figure 2 there would need to be replaced. And then you have full face masks or respirators, like figure 3, where you've got an inbuilt visor as well. And these are really useful. Powered respirators, or powered hoods, are the 2 images on the right there. They work by a battery pack that's usually attached to the waist, where air is pumped in through a filter into a hood or space around the face. So it's essentially creating a positive pressure. These are really useful because they fit everybody. You don't need a fit test for these. The downside is that they need to be decontaminated, and they're quite bulky to wear and to store. The batteries also run low, and you have a beep when that happens to give you enough time to get out of your space, but it means that they need to be maintained. So that's kind of the downside to those, as well as the price of them. So FFP and Ns, what do they mean? So we have in Europe the FFP 1, 2, and 3. So the filtering face piece, these are the disposable respirators. The P1, P2, and P3 refers to the minimum filtration efficiency of 80%, 94%, and 99% respectively. In American standards, this is the N95, N99, and N100. Now you can have N, R, and P. So N means not resistant to oil, R is resistant to oil, and P is oil proof. So that means that the N95 is tested against a dry particulate aerosol. The R is tested against a more liquid aerosol. These are different from the FFPs because the FFPs have that in the standard as standard, if that makes sense. So that covers both liquid particulate testing and dry particulate testing, which is why they're slightly different. The FFP2 is broadly equivalent to the N95 based on its minimum filtration efficiency, and the FFP3 similarly to the N99. Interestingly, the Chinese equivalent is known as the KN95. So if like us last year, you may have used some of these KN95s. It can be very difficult to know the difference between an FFP1, 2, and 3 just by looking at them. So the 3 masks on the right-hand side there, there's an FFP1, 2, and 3. And if I were to ask you which one you thought was the FFP3, I'd hazard a guess you might think the bottom one because of the attachment on the front there. But actually, it's not the case. So 3M colour code their masks, which is very useful. So yellow straps, red straps, and blue straps. The yellow straps refers to an FFP1, the blue straps an FFP2, and the red straps an FFP3. The item on the front of the FFP2 there with the blue straps, that's an exhalation valve, which aids comfort. So as you're breathing out, a valve opens so that you don't get hot air around your mouth there. So it just means that it's a bit more comfortable to wear. The other way to know which type you're about to wear is that it usually says on the front of the mask, as you can see, there's some typing on the front of those. So it's really useful just to have that information. In the UK, because we don't have any workplace exposure limits, we recommend the use of an FFP3, so the highest protection of mask. This is not the same throughout the world, and again, it depends on your risk assessment. Okay, so if you're wearing a reusable mask, you need to add filters, and which filter do you need to add? So the filter that you require for a reusable respirator is a type P, a particulate filter, which is color-coded with a white stripe. You can see quite easily on the top image there. But the filters will also protect against a number of different chemicals, or chemicals and particulates. And these are denoted by a code of letters and a color code. Just one thing to note, that if you are needing protection against chemicals, whilst they're like on the top and bottom filter images there are a number of different it will offer protection against a number of different chemicals. It doesn't mean that if you walked into a room with all of those chemicals there that it will protect you. It just means it will offer you protection against one, possibly two of those chemicals in that room, not necessarily all together, because they'll have different affinities going through the filter. It's just something to bear in mind. So fit testing and fit checking. Fit testing is required so that you've got the right respirator and size of respirator for your face. As you can see in the picture, you can see that the glasses are steamed up, showing that the respirator doesn't actually fit that individual correctly. So air is passing between the filter and the face. And then fit checking, which is something we do every time we put on a respirator to make sure it fits correctly. So fit testing, I'm sure you will have gone through before. There are two types, qualitative and quantitative. They are equally good. The qualitative test means that you have a hood put over you while you're wearing your respiratory protective device, and either a bitter or sweet chemical is inserted into the airspace within that hood. You then go through a number of exercises, which are defined in the table on the right there. And if you can taste that chemical, then it's not fitting you correctly. If you can't, then it is. Really simple, really good. The quantitative version is a similar test, except that the mask is hooked up to a machine as well as your face, and aerosol of salt solution is delivered into the air, and the number of particles outside the mask versus inside in the breathing zone of the mask is compared, again using the same number of exercises. So the fit test needs to be carried out prior to wearing a respirator so that you know that you've got the right one. Fit checking is something that you do each time you put on the respirator that's correct for you. Fit checking means that you put it on as per manufacturer's requirements, and you check that it actually fits. And to do that's quite difficult on a filtering face piece respirator, because you've got to cover the whole material with your hands and take a breath in. And as you take a breath in, the respirator should kind of collapse inwards so that you kind of blocked the airflow. And again, on an exhalation, it should kind of inflate. For reusable respirators, you cover the filters on the outside as shown in figure A, and breathe in. And then on the exhalation, there's usually an exhalation valve, and you cover the exhalation valve and do the same thing. Okay, so I just wanted to quickly touch on surgical masks. I think we all know that they're not regarded as respiratory protective equipment, but they do offer some protection. And I've left you a link there to some research we did related to that. There are 3 types of surgical mask: type 1, type 2, and type 2R. Type 1 has a minimum filtration efficiency of 95%, type 2, 98%, and type 2R means that it's a type 2, 98% minimum filtration efficiency and is splash resistant. Okay, so this is Fred. I thought I'd drop in a video if it works, touch wood. So this is a breathing head that's in a box. You add smoke to it and you pull a plunger, which is essentially in his lungs. So you'll see the smoke go into his lungs without a respirator on. Then you'll see the difference wearing a respirator, again wearing a respirator but that's ill-fitting, and then a respirator and then a surgical mask just to see the comparison. So hopefully this will work. Okay, so you've got smoke going in there. The lung is underneath. So this is the lung. You can see the smoke going in there. This is wearing a respirator. You can see the protection offered there. This is an ill-fitting respirator, so the seal isn't fully sealed. And you can see that the smoke gone into the lung there. And finally, the surgical mask, just to show the comparison. And I think you can see that whilst there is some smoke in there, it's not as much as what it was to start with. So I thought it was kind of an interesting one. So yeah, thanks to HSE for that. Oh, how do I escape? Okay, so that's a whistle-stop tour of respiratory protective equipment. The last and possibly the most important, because we handle biological agents with our hands, is gloves. There are, as you know, many different types of gloves. Fit is important, dexterity is important, choosing the right gloves and pre-use checks, donning and doffing, and hand hygiene are all important. So choosing the right gloves will be determined by the hazard, i.e. what biological agents, whether there are thermal hazards, so our cryogenic storage or using the autoclave, for example. The activity will also play a part, and dexterity, and we'll go into a few of those. So there are a number of different types of glove materials, and I won't go into them all, but there are some companies that offer a service whereby you can go online, check what you need to be protected against, particularly chemical wise, and it will identify the right glove for you in a color-coded traffic light system like you can see here. It's worth bearing in mind though that the gloves that they will offer you are usually quite thick because they're based around neat chemicals and they don't take into account volume. So we might be working with microliters rather than liters, for example. It's important, I think, to know that there are some middle ground alternatives. So this is an example of a neoprene nitrile mix that offers more chemical protection than your standard nitrile glove, but is not as thick as some of the gloves that they might offer you to wear, which is an important consideration as part of your risk assessment. How do you know that they'll protect you? There are 2 different protective factors here. So the one on the left protects you against biological agents. the way that you know that through the standard is that the glove will either be filled with water and it'll be checked for leaks, or it'll be filled with air and submerged underwater and checked for bubbles. And that's thought to be okay for bacteria and fungi. In 2016, another standard was brought into play that tested the material against a viral challenge, against a phage. So you'll know which one has been tested against, specifically against a virus, because it'll have the term virus underneath it. So the first one doesn't mean it won't protect you against viruses, just means it hasn't specifically been tested. Obviously, thermal and cool protection. This is mechanical protection. So if you need some kind of mechanical protection, you'll see underneath the standard that it will offer notes about whether it's abrasive resistant, tear resistant, puncture resistant, blade resistant, etc., which you might need. There are other items on, particularly on the glove packets, so might be associated information. The one in the middle just refers to the expiry date, and the one on the right there just refers to where it was manufactured. So I think this is a really important one, and probably the most important one in terms of gloves. So if I asked you, what do you think that would protect you against? I think you would come back and say alkalis, which is what everybody normally tells me. But it actually doesn't mean that. Each letter stands for a different chemical. So the A is methanol, K is sodium hydroxide, but only at 40%, and L, sulfuric acid. So it's worth checking that out if you need protection against these things, because I think a lot of the nitrile gloves, I think you've got about an hour before isopropanol, for example, will transfer through the material. And if the alcohol can then transfer through the material, then it might be able to take other things with it. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Fit. So fit's really important, as I'm sure you're aware. If they're too tight, then you're going to cause strain on the glove material. Any minor holes will be enlarged, it's more likely to tear. If the gloves are too large, then I think we've probably all been in that situation where you've got part of your glove stuck in an Eppendorf tube. So fit's really important. It's also important to have lots of different sizes of gloves. If you're anything like me, I need a small size in the winter, and then when it comes to the summer months, I need a larger size because I've swelled. So it's worth bearing that in mind. So just to touch on dexterity. Obviously, we need thicker gloves for things like removing items from cryo store, but there might be times when we're working with thicker glove materials, but that can increase the likelihood of having an incident. So the picture on the right there, rather, it's obviously quite cluttered in there anyway, but it might be worth having larger tubes if you're having to work with gloves that are quite thick to enable better use, or changing the type of work that you're doing so that you don't have to use such a thick glove type. In some cases, it might be beneficial to wear 2 pairs of gloves. And if you're doing that, so if you're wearing, for example, 2 pairs of nitrile gloves, to have a pair of gloves underneath that's of a different color, so like the orange gloves in the middle, and a different color on the top, so that if the top layer becomes perforated, for example, then you can see it underneath. So for training, we often use, or rather we used to often use, these kind of checkerboard challenges where you have coupons with different colors on each side, and get your colleagues or trainees to wear different glove thicknesses, different glove types, different glove sizes, and have a bit of competition where you race each other to see who can turn their checker chips over the soonest. It's a really good method for showing people the differences in dexterity, and the same you can do on the right hand picture there with pins and putting those in holes as well. And it highlights that if you are having to wear thicker gloves, that you need to you need to increase the time allowance for manipulation, because you need to be more careful. So pre-use checks. Pre-use checks are really important, but they can't always be carried out. So for example, for certain molecular techniques, forensics, etc., it might not be possible. But they're important because, as we know, we've all taken a glove out of the box and it's torn. And there is a quality level known as an acceptance quality level or acceptance quality limit that I've circled there in yellow. And that is the number of gloves tested in a batch that are likely to fail, and that's a percentage. So you can see there that says 1.5. So 1.5% of the gloves in a batch that have been tested will fail. So in 2 of those boxes, 3 gloves will fail. And it might be that we don't see that failure when we take the glove out of the box. So how do we test whether the glove's intact? So we need to inflate the glove, pushing air towards the fingers. If it remains inflated, it's fine to wear. If it isn't, it should be discarded and thrown away. But it's just to bear in mind that we shouldn't be blowing our gloves up by blowing into them for 2 reasons. First of all, we don't want that hand-to-mouth contact. And secondly, when you breathe into the glove, you're transferring moist air, so it would be more difficult to put on. So instead, if you just open the glove at the cuff and draw it up into the air and then push the air down, it may take a little bit of practice, but it works very well. And this is another test for trainees. It's a really good one. If you take a number of different glove sizes and deliberately put holes in them, so even just 1 or 2 holes, usually between the fingers, in the webbing in the fingers of the glove is pretty good. Get a bowl of warm water, ask people to put 1 glove on and put it into that warm water. Put their hands into the warm water, not enough to cover the cuff because obviously the water will go down the cuff. But then tell them that you've only perforated some of them, and do they think they've got a glove that's been perforated? And most people will say no, because they can't feel the change in temperature. There's no change in temperature. They can't feel the water going into the glove, and yet when they take the glove off, there's water on their hands, so they know that they've become contaminated. And it highlights that you might not necessarily know if your hands have become contaminated during the course of your everyday lab work if the glove's been perforated. And therefore you can highlight the importance of hand hygiene. I've just highlighted a common areas that people miss during hand washing and included the hand washing procedure that's outlined in the Lab Biosafety Manual and the PPE monograph. And just a final challenge for trainees, which I think is really good, and it highlights a few cross-contamination issues in the lab. So you can use fluorescent markers such as glow germ or whatever. And what we used to do in training is get a few groups of people together in teams, have some samples ready in the normal way that they would arrive in packaging to you, either in like a liquid nitrogen store or via a box and a tub, and ask them to transfer liquid material from one tube to another, and then into a cryotube, and then into a box, and set each team against each other so that you're adding a layer of pressure and a layer of speed, much akin to if you're in an outbreak situation and you've got lots of samples to process. And you will often find that they will contaminate not just the bench, their gloves. If you've asked them to swap, they will contaminate and cross-contaminate samples. And it highlights that their gloves will become contaminated, equipment will become contaminated, and therefore they've got to be really careful when they remove that PPE. And it's really good in terms of training. So just finally then, key principles, I think, in terms of PPE needs to be selected through a thorough assessment of the risks, needs to be fit for purpose in accordance with local and national regulations or adopted international standards, assessed for its effectiveness, suit the wearer in terms of size and fit, compatible with multiple items. So for example, it's one thing I've just missed actually, is when you're having your fit test with your respiratory protective equipment, if you need eye protection or you wear glasses, then that eye protection on your glasses need to be in place during that fit test because they might be incompatible with one another. Training in terms of is a necessity on how to use it, how to put it on, how to take it off, etc. And knowing its limitations, because no PPE is 100% effective. Report any defects, any incompatibility issues, changes in size requirements. And there are no exemptions from the risk assessment based rule, i.e. it must be used as you've said you're going to use it in practice. And if in doubt, ask a manufacturer, colleagues, etc. So with that then, I hope I'm not too over time. Just to thank Sasha and Chris and my ex-HSE colleagues as well for some of their images that they lent me, and everyone that helped with the LBM4 and the PPE monograph. And I had put Roger Rabbit in there, and Sasha pointed it out that it's not Roger Rabbit, it's Bugs Bunny, but they both wear gloves, which is a good job for Bugs Bunny, because if he didn't, he'd be totally naked. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kat. I think everybody is giving you a virtual applause. And if we can go straight to the Q&A box, there is one question that I think maybe multiple persons might have that particular concern. So I'll ask you to answer that question live, Kat, if you don't mind, and just acknowledging that Dr. Kaz Kojima has been able to join us. So welcome, Kaz. Always great to have you join our sessions. Persons please don't use the chat box. For questions, please use the Q&A box, which is right next to the chat box. Okay, so Imelda, if you can just type your question there, we will get to it afterwards. Thanks, Kat. Over to you.
Thank you. So regarding the slingback shoes, I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because I mean, I see a lot of people in the lab wearing pumps, and they don't really offer you any heel protection. So where do you draw the line? What's it protecting you from? I guess that's your local policy. I don't really see so much of an issue. So I mean, if they were, because you've still got a strap around those, haven't you, at the back? So they're not going to slip off your feet. So I don't think that's so much of an issue. And in terms of the Croc shoes with the holes in at the top, or in the lab, yeah, again, it's not ideal, but there are, yeah, you could wear socks with them. They're not ideal, but again, I've got pumps that are just mesh, and that would be deemed acceptable. So it depends on your local policy. That would be my answer.
Thanks, Kat. I will ask anyone else on the panel if they'd like to also give their thoughts, because this is something that we recognize. It's always a matter of the risk and what are we trying to protect against. So from a biological perspective, is it that you're trying to protect getting infected if something falls, or is it a physical hazard? Because those types of shoes don't offer that type of protection. Of course, and especially the Crocs with the holes in them, and additionally, even if you have socks, yes, a slightly added layer of protection. But in terms of physical hazards, you know, bumping into things falling on your feet, and with the heel out. So again, depends on what you're doing, and as you said, your local policies.
Yeah.
And Chris, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I second what you just said, Sasha. I think it poses much more of a physical hazard, particularly if you're working with chemicals, acids, you know, or strong bases, that sort of thing. You know, you have a much higher risk of you know, burning your skin, and also things falling on your feet that could be more dangerous. But I agree, physical hazard much more so than the contamination issue. Over.
Great. So colleagues, we welcome you to continue placing your questions in the Q&A box. We will have a few minutes at the end. And Kat, thank you so very much again. And be like both Roger Rabbit and Bugs Bunny and make sure that you wear your gloves appropriately. Yes.
Thank you.
So we move over to our next presentation, another hot topic, decontamination and waste management. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Ofra Arajo. And you can tell from the name that Ofra is a national of Brazil, where she began her work and earned her Master of Science and doctorate degrees in microbiology from Sao Paulo. And she is now a health scientist in the Quality and Safety Systems branch with the Division of Laboratory Systems at the Center for Surveillance, Epidemiology, and Laboratory Services at the CDC. And she helps to develop data-driven strategies to improve safety and quality in the clinical and public health laboratories in the US. And in addition to working previously in the Division of Scientific Resources, where she would have led different studies, including one on laboratory waste inactivation, which helped to generate the data that was used by the CDC for the guidance on the disposal of laboratory waste and the autoclave safety course that is currently available through the HHS Learning Portal. Dr. Rajo is also a graduate of CDC's Laboratory Leadership Service Program, and she also served as its program lead for the period 2017 to 2018. And as you can imagine, she has a lot of experience in different regions, including during the 2014 Ebola response in West Africa, the polio outbreak investigation in Angola in 2019, and she continues to serve as a biosafety subject matter expert during this time. So Ofra, welcome to you. Thank you for your time, and we're really looking forward to your presentation. So I will share that for you as well. And I would ask colleagues to ensure from the panel that I'm sharing it in the appropriate format as well. Okay, so just let me move this bar here. Just want to make sure that I'm sharing only the slide. Is that good there?
That's good.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Sasha, for that.
Thank you.
And thank you for advancing the slides for me. Thanks for the organizers for inviting me to talk with you today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It is great to have the opportunity to connect with you today. And I'm excited to talk with you about decontamination and waste management. Next slide, please. Yes, so everyone knows about that. Next slide. All right, so the goal here today is to talk with you about the topics listed in this slide. Let's move on, please. Just a brief introduction to set the backdrop for today's talk. Let's keep in mind who is involved in the process as the first bullet in there. What we need to focus on when we are talking needs to be in our mind when we are talking about decontamination and waste management. And really, I think any topic laboratory related is risk and evidence-based approach. If any work in the lab involves a culture of safety and good microbiological practice and procedure. Finally, the management of waste must include a validated decontamination process, which is determined by the risk assessment. So with that in mind, let's dive in. Next slide. This presentation is entirely based on the LBM4 and the Decontamination and Waste Management monography. General concepts of decontamination and waste management can be found in the WHO NBL4, in sections, mainly in section 3 or core requirements, but also you find a bit of information in section 4, the heightened control measures, and in section 5, the maximum containment measures. More detailed information can be found in the Decontamination and Waste Management monography, which is the focus of today's presentation. Next. Let's talk about decontamination then. Next slide. In general, decontamination processes are designed to make waste safe to dispose of or to remove or destroy biological agents on laboratory surfaces. As you can see represented in this figure, from the bottom up, the decontamination process becomes more specific. So we go from cleaning, which is just reducing viable biological agents, then disinfection when we are eliminating viable biological agents, and finally sterilization where we are eliminating and destroying all viable biological agents and spores. Next. And this slide was shown as well by Kat in her presentation, and nowadays more than ever, so important, wash your hands. We've been hearing that the laboratory practice has been, and infection prevention control practices have been now popularized more than ever with COVID-19 pandemic. So hand washing here is shown in detail as an example of cleaning, which reduce biological agents. Next. This slide is just to show the different categories of decontamination. And so we think about chemical or physical, and within chemical, then we are talking about gas and vapor, or liquid types of the chemical decontamination, and then physical when we are more focused on heat. Next slide, please. The most common chemical disinfectants are shown here. All disinfectants have their pros and cons, as I'm sure you laboratory professionals know. I would like to highlight hypochlorite as the most used disinfectant. Hypochlorite is relatively inexpensive and active against most species, including spores and prions. The effective concentration and contact time are a function of the biological agent being decontaminated. Higher concentrations are required for spores and prions. As it relates to the other chemicals in this figure, everything depends on, risk assessment, right? And the validation of the method of disinfection. So in general, hypochlorite is the most used, and that's what I wanted to highlight from this slide. Next slide, please. So here, I wanted to just highlight some factors that affect chemical disinfection, and those are listed on this table: concentration of the agent. So that's why I mentioned validation and risk assessment before, because depending on what is the pathogen in question, you need to verify that. So either you are going to look at the literature and see studies that have been done before, and they have the recommendation. And even when you do that, it's also recommended that you validate that in your lab for your specific procedure with the pathogen that you are working on. So then we have, and I highlighted here the topics, but of course you have this in detail in the monography. The concentration, the organic matter in the specimen that you're analyzing, the pH. So certain chemicals, they function only, they are active only in a specific pH range. So that needs to be taken into account. The contact time, that's a big one, especially during the COVID-19 response. We saw that a lot, and that was a big question that sites as nursing homes, and especially folks that didn't have a lot of experience in laboratories doing rapid tests for COVID, we received that question a lot. So what is contact time? The time that the agent will, the disinfectant will be in contact with the biological agent, that's important. Air bubbles, if you have air bubbles in the sample, that's in, the chemical is in suspension or may not get really good contact with the biological agent, and that may not, in that case, may not be able to disinfect properly. Next slide, please. Range of microbiocide activities. So for instance, depending on if you are working with spores, are these, you know, how resistant they are, non-enveloped viruses, all that need to be taken into account. The temperature, usually the higher the temperature, the more effective the disinfectant will be. But that varies. Really, really high temperature may, in certain areas, may, for instance, may evaporate the liquid in the solution, and that may alter the final concentration, which can then affect the decontamination process. And of course, self-life or stability of the agent itself is important. Next. Then we get to gas or vapor types of disinfection, also known as fumigants. Gas disinfectants are mainly used in laboratories with maximum containment measures, but other non-maximum containment facilities may use fumigation as a means for decontamination. For example, during a post-spill event. Based on risk assessment, fumigation can be used to decontaminate the laboratory space, furniture, and equipment such as a biosafety cabinet. Here, when we look on the left, we have the most, in my experience, the most used and cheaper types of gas or vapors, disinfectants, hydrogen peroxide and chlorine dioxide, and on the left, formaldehyde, which is a more hazardous process, needs to be conducted at certain temperature and humidity, and really requires especially trained personnel and respiratory protective equipment. On the other side, those are more, the left side, we have safer and more environmental friendly chemicals, vapors, sorry, to be used. And they are usually faster and more expensive. Next slide. Then when we talk about heat disinfection, there are basically we can classify in two different types, the dry heat and the moist heat. So if we talk about dry heat, we are talking about incineration, hot air oven, where we are going at temperatures above 160 centigrades for 2 to 4 hours. If we are talking about moist heat, then we are talking about autoclaving, boiling, and disinfection of solid waste, for disinfection of solid waste. boiling does not remove all biological agents, but it is used as the minimum processing for disinfection when other methods are not available. And autoclaving is the most common heat disinfection method. Next slide. So here I have this figure from the LBN4 with the autoclave depicted here. There are the things when we talk about autoclave, we always need to take to consider is the time, excuse me, the time that the cycle you run, the temperature, the pressure, and the type of cycle that you'll be using. It can vary humongously. The protocol may vary humongously, depending also if you are using an autoclave with vacuum or without vacuum. So that's to say that there are too many variables, and it's necessary to validate this procedure to really determine what works best for your institution with your autoclave type and the type of waste that you are trying to decontaminate. There are autoclave cycles operating with a vacuum, which is called active type of autoclave, or without vacuum, which is called a passive autoclaving process. With the active, we are talking about autoclaves that have a vacuum pump, and the chamber is what you see inside this figure, is subjected to successive pressure changes to draw air from the chamber through a vent filter. This is required for loads such as waste bags, as represented in this figure, glassware, and other equipment where trapped air cannot reliably be removed by passive method. The more difficult air is to remove, the more pressure pulses will be required. What do I mean by that? As you see in this figure, you have steam coming in and air being removed. With an autoclave that has a vacuum pump can more effectively or efficiently remove the air from the autoclave. As the air is being removed, more steam is able to penetrate the autoclave and consequently get in contact with whatever is inside the autoclave that you want to decontaminate or disinfect. Because of that, say this bag shown here in this picture needs to be open, and you see an arrow showing the steam coming in. So that's really important for the hot steam to get in contact with whatever you intend to be decontaminated. So the other method is the passive, and that's a type of autoclave that doesn't have a vacuum pump. So in that case, steam enters the chamber and cold air is pushed out by the steam. So it's a less efficient process. This is a simpler method, but it is the only suitable for loads which do not impede the removal of air from the chamber. So there are situations where that's the only type of autoclave that's available, and that's okay. It's just that then the method needs to be validated and tested to verify that's being effective to your specific needs. Next slide. And this again is just a summary of the different types of autoclave, and you have from the simpler one at the top with gravity displacement all the way to the bottom with the pre-vacuum and the specific characteristics of each one of them. I think in the interest of time, we can move to the next one. I'd like to highlight safety precautions as it relates to autoclave. Of course, we know we are dealing with a big piece of equipment that, you know, is under high pressure and high temperature. So this slide shows a list of general safety precautions when using an autoclave. Operation and maintenance needs to be done by trained individuals. The operations instructions, the cycle programs that will be used need to be well defined and established. So it means it needs to be validated and tested and validated. So people using will know that it's effective. Develop a loading plan. So this is about, imagine that inside of the autoclave, if you have everything cranked inside, there is not a space for the steam to circulate and get in contact with everything inside the autoclave. So having a loading plan and really method of how the waste is going to be placed inside the autoclave is really important. Maintenance program needs to be done by a qualified personnel, and there are tests that are used to measure the amount of steam in the autoclave and all the parameters to make sure the autoclave is working properly. Of course, regular verification processes, and for that, there are indicators that can be used, such as the biological indicator. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And vacuum leak tests for autoclaves as well. And also for pre-vac autoclaves is important that actually for any type of autoclave that the source of steam is clean steam. We are talking about decontamination of waste, but also in some case, autoclave can be used for sterilization, and that's even more so necessary that the saturated steam be clean and no chemicals inside the autoclave. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. So the containers to be used inside the autoclave need to be containers that allow for removal of air and again, good contact with the steam. We talk about the inside of the autoclave, how to have the whatever you want to autoclave placed inside in a manner that allows for steam contact, but it's also important that when you pack the material to be autoclaved, you take that into consideration. So, for instance, that autoclave bag needs to have a standardized opening, so to allow steam to get in contact with the waste inside. Some folks will close the bag really tight, and that won't allow steam to get in contact with the content inside the bag. So that's not a good practice. And of course, I mentioned before, never, ever place hazardous materials such as bleach, mercury, radioactive components inside the autoclave. People handling the autoclave, the waste, and working on an autoclave, they need to wear appropriate PPE. So that includes thermal protection gloves, eye and face protection, and whatever else is determined by their institution and their risk assessment. And of course, the importance again of maintenance is verify that valves and drains are not blocked by material inside autoclave. That's a huge deal because if people pack an autoclave bag and they close the bag tightly with the pressure inside the autoclave, that bag is going to explode or burst inside the autoclave. And then whatever contents you have inside that bag, say gloves or lab coats, paper towel, they are going to spread inside the autoclave. And when that happens, those materials may clog valves and drains in the autoclave that can not only damage the autoclave, but also make the process inefficient. Next slide. Then the other heat procedure is incineration, and incineration is useful for disposing of animal carcasses as well as anatomical and other laboratory waste with or without prior decontamination. Incineration of materials can be an alternative to autoclaving depending on the laboratory needs. Effective incineration requires an efficient means of temperature control and a way to ensure complete combustion of all flammable materials. Other methods of burning waste can be single combustion chamber, but that may not be suitable for dealing with infectious materials, animal carcasses, and plastics. It depends. Incineration with secondary chamber, the temperature in the primary chamber should be at least 800 centigrades, and that's in the secondary chamber at least 1,000 centigrades. So you can imagine incineration. In my experience, if you are using an incinerator that big and two-chamber incinerator, which would be the ideal, is expensive and also is not very environmental friendly. So people keep trying to develop new methods of incineration and new types of incinerators that are more environmental friendly. Next slide. So then the next topic is sterilization, and sterilization is used when a complete elimination of any biological agent, including spores and prions, is necessary. For example, for medical items and waste, if the risk assessment indicates the need for very strict decontamination procedures. Sterilization can be achieved by using several decontamination methods. And so we have here listed a few: autoclaving, certain chemicals, disinfectants, gaseous disinfection, combined with a strict SOP and irradiation. Biological indicators are used to monitor the effectiveness of sterilization process as well. And in the next slide, you can see some examples of biological indicators used in sterilization procedures. Next slide. Indicators are routinely used to check the effectiveness of decontamination processes. Most frequently used biological and chemical indicators. So here you have the two of them listed with some of their main characteristics. If sterilization process, on the left side, I have an example of biological indicator, and that's the Geobacillus stereothermophilus. In this type of indicator, when used, for instance, in an autoclave, say you were validating your waste disposal procedure and you want to use this indicator. If sterilization process is not effective, spores will germinate, grow, and release an acid that can be detected by a pH indicator dye present in the growth medium. This figure shows this biological indicator, or BI, tubes. You can see unused vial that was not autoclaved on the left of the figure, and failure control vial that changed from purple color to yellow after the spores grew. So that's on the center of the picture. And then on the right, you have an example of a biological indicator that passed. It remained purple color, but there is no growth. I want to call your attention for these little bars. You see the black bars and then horizontal bars above the media. So on the one on the left, which is unused, you see the black bar, and then on top of that, you see the blue horizontal bar. So that shows me this has not been, is just off the box, right? I didn't put it in the autoclave. The one in the center, I know it didn't pass, so it was autoclaved, but it didn't pass. Besides being yellow, which shows growth, also has the blue line, which shows that no steam has gotten in contact with this indicator. And then on the far right, you have the gray bar on top of the black one. So that tells me that steam from the autoclaving procedure has get in contact with this biological indicator, and has also killed the spores, was enough to kill the spores in the liquid. That's why when I incubate this biological indicator, there is no growth, as opposed to the one in the middle where let's say this was inside an autoclave bag that was closed really tight. Steam did not penetrate the bag, and therefore the vial did not hit the right temperature to kill the spores. So when I incubate this vial at the proper temperature for growth, the spores will grow and will turn the media in yellow. So that's the very simple way of using a biological indicator to verify if your autoclaving process is working as well as it should. And then there are chemical indicators, and different than the biological indicators, they provide an immediate result. So here there is no time for incubation to see the result of the test you are running. They are indirect variables in the sense that you are not measuring something that is growing there directly, but you are measuring, say, for example, with the Bowie-Dickey test, you are measuring the removal of air in an autoclave, and you are not measuring how much air is being removed, but you are measuring, I don't have a picture of the Bowie-Dickey test, but what you are measuring is the result on that type of paper. It changes color based on the amount of air that has been removed. So different types of indicators, biological and chemical. Next slide, please. So now we are going to talk a little bit more in detail about, since we talk about decontamination, and now more specific about waste management. So some considerations, documentation and record keeping, and finally removal and safe disposal of the waste products from the laboratory. Next slide. Oops. I think there is one before this one, Sasha. Maybe I said too fast. So, yes, this one, thank you. Wanted to talk about risk assessment. because as everything else that we talk, and I know you've heard that before because you had your risk assessment session a few weeks ago, risk assessment is really important in everything that's done in the lab. So you have here all the topics that must be included when you are doing a risk assessment as it relates to waste management. So you need to consider everything listed in this slide, which I don't need to read for you, but it's really important. All personnel handling contaminated materials need to be trained and must wear appropriate PPE. As a lab professional is really, I find that's really important to engage the everybody in the process of waste management, from the scientists working in the lab all the way to waste handler or whomever is going to retrieve the waste from the autoclave and stain the waste for disposal, final disposal. Everybody involved in that process from beginning to end need to participate in the risk assessment for waste management. And that's all I say, because I can spend hours talking about that. Next slide, please. Here, yes, now we have some examples of laboratory waste. And of course, here is just to demonstrate a few examples of the waste we generate when we are doing our work in the laboratory. I'm sure all of you are well familiar with that. Next slide. This table shows a summary of different categories for segregation of laboratory waste and their recommended treatment. This is all from the LBN4. A process for the identification and segregation of contaminated materials must be adopted before decontamination or disposal. And these processes need to abide by the international standards and sharks injury protection may apply if you are autoclaving sharks as well, or anyways, you'll be disposing sharks. So you'll be decontaminating sharks as a result of the waste generated in the lab. So needs to follow all those international guidelines. Next slide. So then let's talk about the treatment of decontaminated waste. And so what happens is either in laboratory.
Hi, Afra?
Yes.
Yes, just a quick point, please. We are approaching the time that we were supposed to end, but I would ask our colleagues on the webinar with us if they're able to stay with us to the end. We would really appreciate that. I think the information it's a lot of excellent information that we can all benefit from. So with that in mind, Afra, please, you continue and we will be answering the questions at the end.
Okay,
So
I will
stay on. And at this time, I'll ask that my colleagues just place the link for the survey, participant survey, in the chat box in interest of time. Thank you.
Sure, I try to go faster. So different types of considerations, what you are going to do if you are going to treat the contaminated waste on-site or off-site. And just again, keep in mind, it needs to abide by the local, national, international regulations, international standards, and local laws, policies, and guidelines as well. Next. Next slide. Okay. Keeping clear records of the waste stored, their treatment methods and disposal dates ensures good waste management control. The documentation listed in this slide should be gathered and is relevant in case of an emergency as well. Next slide, please. So then considerations about liquid waste and next slide, solid waste as well. So I'm moving fast here because we talk in detail about the procedures for liquid decontamination and decontamination using autoclaving and incineration and things like that. I think we can move to the methods of inactivation, Sasha. Next slide. Yes. And next slide. So inactivation of specimens is a pre-analytical treatment to remove or inactivate biological agents from specimens that you are working with in the lab. These inactivation processes are used in laboratories to make safe working with any material containing biological agents. So the materials can be handled with less rigorous control. And these processes may also be needed to keep proteins, nucleic acids, and other biochemical compounds stable for future analysis. Therefore, such processes need validation. You just cannot start doing it and thinking that it's working properly. You really need to test variables and time and determine what works best for you. Next slide. Here is just some examples of the application of methods for inactivation. So there is lytic solutions with protein denaturants that can be, example is guanidine salts, can be used with or without heat. One example is for nucleic acid extraction for, say, PCR. There is also thermal inactivation. I want to highlight that usually thermal inactivation doesn't work very well alone. In this example I listed here, it works with 5% phenol for preparing sputum specimens from patients potentially infected with Mycobacterium tuberculosis. This is a key step in drying the specimen on a slide warmer. However, heat treatment may fail to completely inactivate Mycobacterium tuberculosis unless 5% phenol is added to the smear. And then another type is ionization radiation, and those are the gamma irradiators, X-ray machines, E-beam accelerators, and they are mainly used for sterilization of medical supplies and devices, or some immunological analysis as well. In conclusion, I would like to highlight that the use of MBL4 documents and associated monographies, such as the decontamination and waste management and the risk assessment monography to develop SOPs to handle pathogenic biological agents in a laboratory is paramount. Decontamination requirements will depend on the type of laboratory activity, the procedure, and the nature of your biological agent in question. And finally, the appropriate waste management strategies depend on the outcomes of the risk assessment. With that, I would like to acknowledge the contributors to the decontamination and waste management monography listed in this first top block here. Especially Dr. Cass, Kat, Rika, who are contributors to the monography and also provided feedback on this presentation. I also thank Chris, Shill, and the organizers for the invitation to present. And I'm sorry I'm over time, but I'm thrilled to answer any questions if folks want to stay a little bit longer.
Thank you very much, Ofra. And we have some extra slides that will be made available. We just let you see this further completion of the presentation. Excellent. Let's see here now. Thank you very much, Offer, for that. And, you know, I think most persons are still on with us. And with that, I would like us to move into the question box. So there is one asked from Patricia asking, what are the recommendations for the use of Paracetic acid? And I wanted you to be able to answer that for us live.
See, I have no experience using Paracetic acid in the processes when I was in the lab. Maybe somebody on the panel has more experience and could answer that, Sasha.
Kat, please go ahead.
Hi, so it depends in what way you mean, what are the recommendations for use of paracetic acid. So using paracetic acid is like using any other disinfectant in that it would need to be validated. We have done some work both in liquid decontamination using paracetic acid and using it as a vapor. It's a really it's a very good disinfectant with a broad range of activity, but it like everything that kills microorganisms, it's hazardous to us too. And I don't know if you use it, but Patricia, but we found it can be quite difficult to get hold of. So it depends what you mean in what way you want the recommendations for the use of it. I'm not quite sure about that.
Thanks, Kat. So Patricia, you can put another question in for defining, but there was a question from Karen, and she wanted to know about the use of ultraviolet light for decontaminating a room. Oh, yeah.
I can. Okay, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Chris.
No, you're the speaker. You can answer. I think we're going to have the same answer anyway, so go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that it needs to be validated. I don't know, Chris, if you have the same answer. It's been a while since I've done lab work, hands-on lab work. But it depends for whatever you need. So I'm sorry, the answer is always, it depends. Because it depends on the agent you are working with and the procedure you are using. I know for biosafe cabinets, the ultraviolet, the UV light is not necessarily effective. I think it depends on the size of the microbe. Say if it's a virus, it depends on the size of the virus. So there are some publications on that. I can send later. I don't remember by heart. What do you think, Chris?
Well, I was going to say, and kind of reiterate what you said, is that a lot of people rely on ultraviolet lights in the biosafety cabinet, but they're not effective for very long. I think initially the bulbs are effective, but they go bad very quickly. And there's no way to know unless you test it. And for an entire room, I think it would be extremely difficult to have the amount of ultraviolet light that would be necessary, even if you knew the bulbs were new and effective after you tested them, to make sure that it was killing. I think it wouldn't be a way to decontaminate a room that I would recommend personally. And, paracetic acid, and I know that's used to, decommission rooms if done in a vapor spray. I haven't done it myself. I will say that, but, I would recommend a different method if you needed to decommission a room, that would be, you'd probably want to use some other type of vapor or something like that, not ultraviolet light. Over.
Yeah, I agree with you, Chris.
Thank you both for that. And Dr. Kaz, are you in a position to speak with us?
No, not necessary. UV is already discussed, not generally recommendable. And also shadow areas, of course, there is no impact. So we have to be very cautious in using UV light. That is our general understanding. Over to you.
Thank you so much to everyone there. I see a question here about the use of steri strips instead of the biological agents. And I guess this is in terms of the autoclave. Does it
Say again, Sasha, the use of what type of strips?
steri strips. I myself am not familiar, but yes.
Yes, if I understand correctly the question, that doesn't replace the biological indicator, because those strips only will change color if to show that the steam has gotten in contact with the area where the strip was placed. But the biological indicator is inside the tube, and then is a real agent that is resistant to high temperatures. And by testing, it's widely known that it will die at 1 hour exposure to 120 degrees. I think it's even a little bit less than 1 hour, maybe 55 minutes, something like that. So that is a better indicator. The strip just says the steam got in contact here. If the steam gets in contact with that indicator for, few seconds, it will change color. So that's really not a good indicator. Yeah, good question.
Thanks. And finally, there's a question about the best way to dispose of formalin waste or citrisol waste from the histology department.
Yeah. So that is inactivating with another chemical, which I cannot recall which one. Anybody on the panel knows. I can look for it and send the response later, but I can't remember by heart.
I don't know citrisol. I'm just chiming in. This is Chris. Formalin certainly would require professional waste handling. That is not something you want to either dump down the drain or put in an autoclave for sure. I'm sure you're cringing right now.
No.
Citrisol, I'm not sure. Does it have citric acid in it, perhaps? I'm not sure that I know exactly what that is either, because I really am not a histologist. But if anybody on the panel does know what that is, that can answer that question, great. If not, we can look it up and then perhaps have a better idea as to how best to dispose of that. I don't want to misspeak, so that one I cannot answer at this time.
Thanks very much. I wanted to actually, and thanks very much, Ofra. I think that it's really, the presentation has really gotten a lot of people thinking about what happens in their own labs, but also for improving the processes. And so I believe that I encourage persons to send any other questions that you may have, that we can actually put you in contact and have these questions answered, and maybe we can post them, question and answer document associated with the files on the website afterwards. I did want to tap back to one question that was asked and answered by Kat, and it was posed by our colleague from Thailand, Ratigorn, asking about the N95s, the N95 masks that usually have 2 straps, but he was asking about the ones that come now with the air loops, if they have the same protective qualification. Kat, I know you answered, but could you just answer it live for us as well?
Sure. So most of the FFP and N type respirators have 2 straps, one that goes around the crown of the head and one that goes around the back of the neck. Usually, I think there's one manufacturer that recommends the possibility of crossing those straps over, but I think there is only one so far that recommends that. So the ear loop straps that are more like a surgical mask type strap have come in and have been suggested that they can offer the same level of protection. So the filter material has passed the necessary standards for FFP2 or N95 equivalents. However, when they're worn, they don't, from the testing that we did, I think it was at the back end of last year, they don't offer the same amount of protection, but we did only test about 8, I think it was 8 different respirators from different manufacturers, going through the fit testing procedure. And for an FFP3 mask, you have to have a pass rate in terms of a quantitative fit test of 100. And I think I got the maximum was 9. So clearly nothing like the protection that you need. And in some of the tests, some of them, the ear loops pulled my ears forward. So they were really uncomfortable. One of them, when I raised my head up, it fell off my nose. So we don't recommend them in the UK, but that doesn't mean that there isn't one out there that's been manufactured that doesn't work. It just means I would be very cautious about wearing them and make sure you're properly fit tested if you're going to go down that route.
Thanks very much. And I guess as these become more available on the market, maybe a bit of research and sharing, seeing the efficacy of them so that laboratorians can make informed decisions. Many of us know you put specs in, but that's not always what you get back when they're procured, because someone else has made particular decisions on what to purchase. So having the evidence to show why it's important to stick with the specs, and there are some superior products versus others. I just want to thank our presenters today. I think it's been excellent. I think the majority of persons have stayed to the end with us. And I want to say that we'll put the entire session up. I think this is one of the sessions where everything in terms of the questions, answers, we need to share it with everyone, so we're all on the same page globally. I do want to thank you for your time, everyone. The survey link is in the chat box, but additionally, you will receive the link in an email 24 hours from now. So you're going to see it tomorrow. So check tomorrow afternoon for the survey link. I know a lot of persons have said they haven't been able to either complete the survey to get the certificate, or they missed it. It's going to come tomorrow, and the link is going to be open until the 21st of September. So you have enough time. Please check your junk or spam folders in case it's gone there. And we're really happy for the feedback. I hope you guys, Chris, Kat, and Offer, you're seeing the feedback from the participants today about how much it's improved their level of knowledge. And we want to capture this as well through our mechanism survey, the participant survey as well. So stay tuned, everyone. We have one more session to go in our series, and we'll be in touch with you on that. But for now, thanks so much for staying with us. There's one question in the Q&A box I'm going to ask Ofra if she can just answer that by typing for us, so we capture it that way. And stay tuned. We will let you know once these presentations and the video recording is posted. Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for your time, for staying with us till the end.
Thank you.
And see you again.
It's been great. Thank you so much.